In the context of what we're going to discuss tonight, even the welcome to country is interesting, isn't it? Because Caleb's Crossing, for instance, deals with issues about taking away indigenous people's land. So this is a discussion which is called Truth is Stranger Than Fiction. Can fiction be stronger than truth? And it can cover a wide range of subjects, as obviously can Geraldine, because, like me, Geraldine has been had a very strong career as a journalist, but unlike me, she turned her attentions to fiction, but fiction which is usually very much grounded in areas of truth. And so some of the things that we might want to talk about are whether historians tell the truth and whether fiction writers can sometimes get at real truths better than the historians, and the duty of both historians and fiction writers to tell the truth. What is truth? Asked jesting Pilate and would not stay for an answer. But the questions of one generation's truth not necessarily being the same as the next generation's truth. I've recently been researching my own family history, and there were Western District of Victoria pioneers who were then regarded as heroes and clearly would not, in the context of that welcome to country, not be regarded as in the same regard since. I have an English ancestor who died in what was called the Indian Mutiny and is now often referred to as the First Indian War of Independence. So history, let's start there. History as something that is plastic, mutable, subject to not only argument but to perspective and interpretation.
Well, I actually married a fellow journalist who is now really a historian, and he thinks he writes the truth, and he thinks I've gone over to the dark side, is what he said. I always liked what Mark Twain had to say on this. He said, fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. And I think it's the implausible truths of history that fascinate me the most. The unlikely thing that if you made it up, nobody would find it very interesting. If I had made up the fact that a young Wampanoag Native American man in the first days of the English colonial experiment, raised in his own language and culture, had mastered English, Latin, and Greek, and gone to Harvard, where he graduated with the sons of the colonial elite in 1665. If I made up that guy, that wouldn't be an interesting story. What makes it interesting is that it is true. And so I think that truth is the foundation. And if Caleb, that young man who actually lived, had kept a journal every day of his time at Harvard telling us what that experience was like for him, then it wouldn't have been necessary to write a novel about him. But because we don't know what it was like, because those details are missing and lost to us, then there's room for an imaginative engagement. Now, is what I wrote about him true? Almost certainly not. But it's an act of imaginative empathy, and I think that's worth doing.
Does any of that excuse the historian from always trying to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and find more real-world facts?
Oh, of course not. That's great. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if in an attic in Lowell or someplace somebody unearthed Caleb's diary?
Or if somewhere in a cave somebody unearthed the parchment by Natan.
Wouldn't that be excellent? Yes. No, I don't think that the historical record's ever closed. And in fact, it's always my starting point with a novel is trying to follow the line of fact as far as you can. And if by any chance you can add your little grain of sand to the sandbox of human knowledge, find a fact, that's wonderful. And that actually happened with Caleb, because after my novel was published, I was contacted by somebody who had a land deed signed by Thomas Danforth, who was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in whose care Caleb was when he died. And in my novel, I had taken that little shred of knowledge that Caleb was in the household of Thomas Danforth to consider the possibility that Caleb had rejected the path that he was supposed to go down, which was to become a minister of religion and go and convert his people, and that he had chosen to become instead a man of the law and to affect the politics and the legal future of the colony. And this person who contacted me had a land deed signed by Thomas Danforth and underneath witnessed by Caleb Cheshtermark, which shows that Caleb was actually working with Thomas Danforth. And so my supposition now has a shred of evidence in support of it. And sometimes you can tease out a new fact.
I just got a little goosebumps there. What was that like, finding that out?
It was very exciting. It was exciting because I wanted that to be true of him. I didn't want him to think he was going to go off and spread Christianity, which was, say it or shouldn't, sitting in this lovely church, a toxic, contagion to spread among people who had a beautiful, life-affirming, generous, animist faith of their own. One of my favorite facts from the historical record that I pillaged a lot from in writing Caleb was a wonderful journal kept by a young minister whose name was Cotton. He was from the famous family of Cottons, and he had fallen from grace because he had bonked one of his parishioners who was married to somebody else at the time. And so in order for him to make amends and cleanse his record, he had to go to Martha's Vineyard and preach to the Wampanoag. And he kept a wonderful journal of all the questions they asked him. And he said the hardest thing was getting them to accept the fact of sin. He said, they will not concede that they themselves have sinned, even though I assure them of it. And they really, really hated the idea of original sin. And one man says to him, why would God make a garden and then forbid his children to eat its fruit? The story makes no sense to me. And even if it's true, even if this man and his wife displeased your God, why would that God be angry with me, who only learned of it this very day? So sometimes the truth is too good to mess with.
Yeah. So that last question was about the duty of the historian towards the facts. What are the duties, if there are any, of the historical novelist towards the facts?
So I think that's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves. I feel a duty to the facts because why would you change them? They're often so remarkable. And to me, the interesting thing is the void, where we don't have the facts, where you have to make the imaginative leap, the empathetic leap to say, well, maybe it was like this. But if you put novel on the book, you have no duty. What's annoying to me is people who write a book labeled nonfiction and make things up. I had a conversation with Tony Wheeler last night.
So did I, actually. Obviously in two different parts of the room.
Yeah.
It was me and Eric Beecher on one side and Tony on the other, and he was being very provocative.
Well, he came to me and said, I have a question not about your book, but about your husband's book. Tony Horwitz wrote a book about Captain Cook called Into the Blue. And Tony Wheeler said, did he make his sidekick Roger up? And if Tony had been there, his head would have exploded. Not only did he not make Roger up, every word that came out of that remarkable Yorkshireman's mouth was exactly what he said. He is a larger-than-life character, or he recently passed away. But Tony got a lot of people who, because of the cheapening of the notion of nonfiction, and because Bill Bryson made up his traveling companion in Walk in the Woods, was it? Yes. So everybody now thinks...
He pretty heavily disguised him.
He pretty much made him up.
Did he?
Yeah, as did... in songlines, Bruce Chatwin made up the guy who was actually Salman Rushdie, and nothing like the person portrayed. And those books being labeled nonfiction is very annoying. And so people thought that Roger was made up. So Tony recently had to write the eulogy for Roger Williamson, and it started by saying people thought I made Roger up, but nobody could make up a man like that.
Yeah, Chatwin's a really interesting example, isn't it? Because people have gone back on a lot of the things that he wrote.
Well, he really did, write heavily researched fiction.
Yeah.
And it would have been fine if he would have labelled it as such.
Yeah, but they're still very beautiful books.
They are beautiful books, but they're annoying to people who write real nonfiction because it doesn't go that way. You don't get the perfectly formed conversation unless you wear yourself out in pursuit of the story. If you get that stuff that is that great, it meant that writer hung around and made a pest of himself and wore out his shoe leather or her welcome to be able to distill something that's true and perfect. But if you can just go home and make it up how you wish it had been, it sets the bar too high for real writers of the truth.
But it's really complicated, isn't it? Because I'm in the middle of reading the Adam Sisman biography of John le Carré, and Adam Sisman has gone back and very, very carefully checked over very large numbers of stories that le Carré has told, in fiction and as non-fiction. And Cornwell, which is le Carré's real name, jokes to him that, I'm really regretting this whole project now. All you're doing is ruining all my good stories. But the point that I'm making is that Cornwell has been telling those stories for years, actually in good faith. And what Sisman has done is to find that he started to fictionalize them as he's told them.
Yes, I think we all do that, don't we? We kind of put that little grace note to an anecdote, and then later on we forget that we did that. But here's something that drives me completely insane, because as a journalist, I always believed if I got a document, I had it. I had the facts. And then in looking into my own father's life, I found out that this is very far from the truth. At the Australian War Memorial, I learned that my father is Canadian.
Really?
He's not Canadian. I have his birth certificate from Santa Maria, California, but when he joined the Australian Army as an American citizen, he thought it would be better if he said he was Canadian.
Okay.
He was a very irregular guy. He was married 4 times, and 2 of his wives were named Gloria, including my mother, who was his last wife. And when it came time to fill out the details for his death certificate, my mother decided that 2 Glorias was altogether 1 too many. So according to my father's death certificate, he was only married 3 times.
Really? Yeah, so even the documents can be fixed. And there's a lot of research now that suggests that witness statements in criminal cases are often malleable also. And there's neuro-linguistic programming. People say that they can more or less get you to say certain things. There are experiments that show that if you've just heard the sound of breaking glass, then you're more likely to describe something in an incident in a more violent fashion than you otherwise would. So there's a lot of doubt being cast on human memory in general now.
We have a lot of trouble in my household because when Tony is telling a story or I'm telling a story over a dinner party with a few glasses of Chardonnay under our belt, sometimes we can't remember who the thing happened to. And so he will start telling about how he gave Naguib Mahfouz a copy of the Satanic Verses. And I know that it was me that gave. And many, many other things that happened to us in the course of our now 30-year marriage. And it's an honest confusion.
There's a song about it. Ah, yes, I remember it well.
Yes, that's right. Although that's people remembering things differently.
Yeah,
we remember exactly the same thing. We just don't remember who it happened to.
Yes. So this is fascinating stuff to me anyway. And it seemed to me that when I read People of the Book recently, it seemed to me that whole story is actually a meditation on all of this in a way. That Anna the Restorer is actually, in a way, Geraldine the novelist.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I'm afraid I did, creep into Anna when she's describing how she works and what she hopes for. That's about the only time, because when I was making up an Australian of my own generation, I wanted her to be as different from me as possible. So my mother was my best friend, so it was fun to imagine what it would be like.
I was just going to say, I hope the mother wasn't your mother.
And, Hannah is quite sexually adventurous, me not so much, but maybe we shouldn't go there.
Perhaps we could just... There are probably people here who haven't read that particular book.
Right.
It's a book about a document.
But it's about an ancient Hebrew manuscript that was created in 14th century Spain and still exists because it's been rescued a number of times by unlikely hands. And some of the rescues we know about, we know that a Muslim librarian saved it from Serbian bombing in the recent siege of Sarajevo. We know that another Muslim scholar saved it from the Nazis during World War II, and that a Catholic priest saved it from being burned in the Pope's Inquisition in Venice in 1609. And we know somebody saved it during the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, but we don't know who. So that's where the imagination comes in. But in that book, too, I was able to find out something that added to the real history. I was trying to research the remarkable Muslim who saved it from the Nazis, and it's such a good story. Can I just take a minute and tell it? So, during the sacking of Sarajevo, after the Nazis marched in, they ransacked all the synagogues and destroyed a number of things. But Hitler had a project in mind for after the war, which was to be the Museum of the Lost Race. And after he'd killed all the Jews, he was going to have a little Jewish Disneyland, and he had set aside some buildings in the Jewish quarter of Prague, and it was going to be stocked with the treasures of European Judaica, which he was systematically looting. And here's a really depraved detail. He was going to hire Czech Gentiles and dress them up as Hasidic Jews so they could walk around for the entertainment of the Aryans. And he wanted this famous manuscript, the Sarajevo Haggadah. So a general, no less, came to the library to demand it. And this very, very brave Muslim scholar took the book. It's very small. He stuck it in the waistband of his pants. He went and confronted the general and said, "I'm so sorry, Her General. One of your officers came just a few days ago and demanded the book, and of course I gave it to him." And the general was furious, and he said, "Who was that officer? Name the man." And he said, "Sir, I didn't think it was my place to be demanding the name of an officer of the Reich."
Yeah.
And then he walked out of the library with the book still hidden under his coat, and he went home. And then there were all kinds of versions of what happened next. And I thought, we should know this. This isn't that long ago. And so I was trying to research it, and I tracked down his niece, who was working as a linguist in the State Department in the US, and she agreed to see me, and she was sharing family documents and translating them for me. And then she looked up and took off her glasses, and she said, "You know, if you really want to know what happened, during that time, you should ask his wife. And I nearly fell over backwards because the guy was 60 during the war, and it hadn't occurred to me that he would have a living widow. And she said, "Oh, yes, Auntie's much younger than Uncle." So my ticket to Sarajevo was bought and paid for that day, and I went and was able to sit with that lovely woman, and she told me exactly what had happened next, which was that he came home, set the thing on the table, they ate lunch together, and decided that the safest hiding place for it would be in a mosque. So he took it up the mountain to a mosque where his friend was the imam, and they hid it among the Qurans.
Yeah, and that totally illustrates your Mark Twain quote, because I thought that was one of the bits that you'd made up.
Yeah.
It's that book is, as I say, the part of the novelist, or rather the historian, I suppose, there is played by somebody who restores manuscripts and understands how vellum is made and how vellum is restored and things like that. And so a lot of it is about forensic science, so that what you then do is you take a page which happens to have a splash of blood and wine.
Well, it's actually got wine. I made up the blood.
Right. So it's interweaving, isn't it?
Yeah, but that
takes you into the Italian ghetto.
Yeah, but that was great fun to research. And, all through the writing of that book, I have this little nagging doubt about how credible my connective tissue person, my Hannah Heath, who's the Australian book restorer, are people really going to buy that an Australian would be called in to do this, even though I've structured a whole reason why she might have been. And so I've been emailing with this guy who's the head of conservation at the Harvard Art Museums, and his name is Narayan Kandahar. And so I was asking him how he would investigate a wine stain. And he said the best way for me to explain it is, and I wanted to know if you could tell the difference between kosher and non-kosher wine. And he said, here's what you could do. You could go and get a bottle of each and bring them over to my lab. And I've got a lot of ancient scraps of parchment hanging around, and we'll splash a bit of wine around, and then I'll show you how I would look at it. And so I arrive, and not many people turn up at the Harvard Art Museum carrying 2 bottles of wine. And I ask for Narayan Kandahar, and this guy comes bounding down to the security desk and says, "G'day, mate." And he's a bloke from Melbourne. So that was terrific.
Yeah.
And so then we went up and we looked at the kosher and the non-kosher wine, and then I said, "Well, what about blood?" And he said, "Well, we don't have any blood." And I said, "Give me your scalpel." "Now we do." So that's what you call suffering for the truth.
Yeah. Well, that is an extraordinary insight into how much actual historical and scientific research you do. Do you do that on all your books?
I really enjoy doing that if the story demands it. I always wait to see where the story wants to go before I do the research. If you do all the research first, there's a real risk that you're going to cram it into the novel whether the story needs it or not. And I always think that that's unfortunate when I encounter that. You can tell the novelist really fell in love with some set of facts, probably because they were very hard to get. Yeah. And they're going to be in the book, whether the book needs it or not. Yeah. I was really enjoying this book. And then I came to a bit where the protagonist is tuning a piano, and another character says, "Must be interesting knowing how to tune a piano. How do you tune a piano?" And the next 10 pages are how to tune a piano.
It's the murder your darlings thing, isn't it? I remember when I was at Four Corners having an argument with the executive producer in the rough cut and saying, "But we walked 3 miles up a mountain to get that shot. That sequence has got to stay in." And then it took me about an hour before I sort of cooled down and thought, no, I'm afraid it's got to go, Yeah. Those are the hardest decisions to make, aren't they?
Yeah, if you walked up a mountain to get it, it's very hard to let.
So when your source material is oral history, myth, legend, what some people would say the rantings of prophets. How do you go about, I'm talking about The Secret Chord now, how do you go about approaching that as a historical novel, if we want to talk about it as a historical novel?
It was very different. There's a great... I didn't really know what I was getting into when I decided to write about David. I assumed that he existed outside the pages of the Bible, but lo and behold, not so much, as it turns out. There's only one stone inscription that even mentions him. Yeah. So how do you do this then? So you have the wonderful story of the Bible, and for argument's sake, I just decided to say that that is true, but what I wanted to do is put it in a gritty Second Iron Age context, to look at what life was actually like in that little notch of land, very sparsely populated at the time. Archaeology and anthropology tells us that there are only 45,000 people in the whole conjectural area associated with David, which is much of modern Israel and part of Syria. And so you look at things like, what was Second Iron Age life? What do we know about what they ate? What were their houses like? When they describe something as a palace, what kind of palace could that be? It's the Iron Age. 3,000 years ago. Turns out it was a palace. You can go and see the beautifully dressed ashlar stones and the incredibly elaborate bas-reliefs of a building that would have been associated with a leader of David's stature.
So one thing you've really got going for you is that there is a huge amount of archaeology in that area.
Archaeology was a great help. Then you can do experiential things. You can convince somebody to let you herd their sheep and goats on a Judean hillside on a hot afternoon.
Did you do that?
Yes. And I love it when metaphors leap off the page and into real life. We were tasked with separating the sheep from the goats.
Yes.
As hard in real life as the metaphor suggests, until you understand the nature of the animals. And I was very interested in why so many leaders in the Bible start off as shepherds. What is it about shepherding that makes it such a great entry-level position for future CEOs? And I was there with my 10-year-old. I love exploiting my kids as research assistants because they ask questions that I wouldn't think of, and they're unjaded in the way they look at things. So what I learned about shepherding is it's a great training for leadership, in that leaders have to understand the people that they're trying to lead. And if you don't know that goats who are fleet-footed and sure-footed will run when you put stress on them, whereas sheep will cluster because they're not as swift, and so they find their safety in bunching together and putting their vulnerable necks over the back of the other sheep so that the predator can't get at them. So once you know that, it's easy to separate them.
Right. There's also the not small question of lions at the time.
Lions at the time, yes. So you have to imagine that. We couldn't experience that, and we certainly didn't experience the adultery and the murder.
Sure. I'll come to that in a minute, but the lions, for instance, feeds you into the question of how David might have slain Goliath.
Well, certainly he had to be very good with a slingshot, or he wouldn't have made it, But the Goliath thing was fascinating because you have to really strip away a lot of mythology for that one.
Yeah.
So what did they mean?
Your description of the armour was really interesting, and the fact that he was so slow-moving as he came down the hill, it's very vivid.
Yeah, so you have to think, what was going on at this valley, this Wadi Elah? And so you have to understand a lot about the context. The context is the Hebrew tribes living very simply. They're fractious with each other. They're not a united people yet. They're herders, sheep herders, and grain producers, and they're in the foothill region. Whereas their biggest enemy are the Philistines, who are city dwellers who live on the coast, where they've got access to trade goods from the more sophisticated cultures of the Mediterranean. They have access to iron, which is a huge technological advantage that they have, and the Hebrew tribes don't. But this is not a grand set-piece battle. This is sheep rustlers, basically. And the defenders of the sheep-herding settlements trying to fend them off. And actually being pinned down is just as good as defeating them, because while you've got them pinned down, your guys can get their crops in. So probably Saul didn't really need to engage Goliath in battle. He could let him come down and shout his taunts and whatnot. Provided he could keep them there, then they weren't raiding the settlements. But here comes this youth who is the low man on the totem pole in his family. He's the despised youngest son with the glamorous, big shot older brothers. And he's tasked with herding the sheep, and then he gets to bring them some food supplies to the battlefield. And he gets there, and he sees an opportunity, and he might not get another one. And so he sees that this heavily armed Philistine is seeking hand-to-hand combat, and he realizes that you don't have to actually engage him on his own terms, and that you can pick him off from a distance. And so then you imagine this fleet, reckless boy with nothing to lose, and a very dab hand with a sling, and a lucky shot, and then he makes his destiny.
It's a very vivid story in the Bible, but you've managed to make it more vivid, and so that must have been a challenge in its own way.
Well, I was thinking about how, it's useful to have been a foreign correspondent, because I'd spent a lot of time hanging out in the desert with Marines during the first Gulf War, and the way they banter with each other and the way they make fun of each other. And I thought maybe Goliath was distracted by bantering. Nobody would take this boy. He's not wearing any armor. There's been this amazingly ridiculous scene where the king, who thinks he's pretty brave, has tried to give him his armor, but it doesn't fit him. It falls down off him because he's so slight. And so here's a slight boy with a staff, a shepherd's crook, and maybe Goliath doesn't see the sling, and he's laughing at him, and then the kid gets off a rock, and maybe his men are taunting him, and he turns around for a minute and he loses his concentration, and that's when David strikes. But it was being with those Marines who are always, taking the piss out of each other that gave me the idea to write it that way.
So David looked at in one way, and you don't flinch from this, is he engages in a number of massacres. You describe him and his men stamping on small children, babies, and killing unarmed and unprotected women. He's obviously polygamous.
Everybody was polygamous.
Yeah, but
can't hold that against the dude. The rest of it's a fair cop.
But he's a rapist. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and he goes against his king, against the state that he is a servant of, and becomes a renegade. I mean, we would call him a terrorist now. How's that gone down?
Oh, well, I think that the Bible's unflinching about him too. I think that is what is so fascinating about this story, and I think it's why it's inspired so many artists over the centuries to engage with it, because he is such a complicated figure. You can't put him in a box. He's, the guy who binds the nation together. He's, shows great mercy in some situations and utter ruthlessness in others. He abuses his power, but then he tries to make amends for it. Not many powerful people do that. He listens to the truth. He allows Nathan in particular to castigate him. The things that Nathan says to him for many powerful leaders, that would be the last thing you ever said, but it only draws Natan closer into his council, because who's there at the end of things negotiating the succession? It's Natan. So obviously David is prepared to accept the criticism and to act on it and to try and make amends for what he's done.
And what do we know about Natan, really? I'm not enough of a Bible scholar to know anything about him. Really.
Well, he's in the two crucial scenes where the most famous is where he castigates David for his adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of his, Uriah, her husband, to cover up his adultery. Very straight talking, and then he's there at the end negotiating to get Solomon enthroned as David's successor. And apart from that, he's described as a prophet. And the Hebrew prophets are fantastic. I love them. They have some of the best writing in the Bible, Isaiah and I'm having a mental blank, but you know who I mean. They're the guys who stand on the city walls and tell us that whatever we're doing is not good enough. And it's quite striking that Yom Kippur, which is the one day when even not very observant Jews schlep to synagogue and fast and pray all day, the reading that day is from a prophet who just castigates everybody. He says, you're fasting, you're praying, you think that's good enough when you're going to go home and deal unjustly with your workers and corruptly in your business? You think you're fooling God? You're not. That's the kind of guy they are. They're pains in the neck, but they're the necessary pains in the neck.
Do you know about Hopi clowns? Do you know about the Hopi tribe in southwest United States, as it is now?
Uh-huh.
Well, they had clowns who performed very similar functions, but they tended to do it by sort of slapping people and pissing on them from the top of a wall,
funny.
But saying the same kinds of things.
Right. The fool, I guess, is another person who tells the truth aslant. But the Hebrew prophets, not so slant.
When you're reading about Natan in the book, you think sometimes of Lear's fool or some of the Shakespearean fools.
And then, there are these two wonderful, intriguing references to the book of Natan, which it says in Chronicles, tells the acts of David the king first to last. So there's this wonderful history that he wrote. And what would such a man who was a truth teller have written? What would we know differently about David if we had the book of Natan? But we don't. So that was what got me excited about imagining it.
Yeah. Do you think, I've repeatedly talked about historical fiction tonight, but do you accept the label? Do you accept that you are a genre writer, or do you think that the label is meaningless?
Oh, I don't have any problem. That is what I do. I write fiction grounded in history because that's what interests me. The contemporary world I would rather engage with as a journalist. I would rather go out and write about what's happening now.
Do you not see a change or transformation in historical fiction? When I was young, there was Georgette Heyer, bodice rippers for girls, and C.S. Forrester, hornblower, sailing the Spanish Main for boys. But now we have Hilary Mantel.
Oh, yeah,
since then there have been Mary Renault.
Mary Renault was back then, too. I think that there have been, she was the first historical fiction writer that engaged me. And I think what she does is remarkable because she brings you into the ancient world with all its strangeness and distance. But she binds you to it by, I think she shares the belief that I also hold that human emotions aren't different, that what shapes us and shapes consciousness is love and hatred and the will to live, and that those didn't feel any different 3,000 years ago than they do today.
Yeah.
And you either believe that or you don't. But if you do, then you write like Mary Renault and you write characters who are emotionally accessible, even though their belief systems and the furniture is completely foreign to us.
Who else do you admire in that?
I adore Hilary Mantel. What she's done in Wolf Hall is breathtaking. I cannot wait for the third. She's the master, I think. There's an American writer called Brian Hall who has written one of my favorite historical novels called I Should Be Extremely Happy in Your Company. It's about Lewis and Clark.
Oh, right.
And he does something quite...
Because there's a Thomas Pynchon about them as well, isn't there?
Yeah, this one is, I think, a masterpiece. And the most daring thing he does is probably the most fascinating character in that adventure is Sacagawea, the Shoshana guide. And this book is an exploration of the consciousness of several of the key people on that journey. And he creates a consciousness for Sacagawea. He learned Shoshana grammar, and she's obviously not thinking in Shoshana or we wouldn't be able to read it, but he uses the structures of Shoshana to convey her thoughts. And at first it's very hard to understand, and then you gradually start to see the world the way she sees it. And it's really masterful. And I think that is such an achievement. I loved Charles Fraser's Cold Mountain. Civil War novel, but not really about the war so much as the impact on one man's mind and his relationship. Rose Tremaine has written some superb, I think Music and Silence was one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Our own David Malouf, An Imaginary Life, wonderful, yeah.
I think I read Persian Boy and Imaginary Life around about the same time, and they totally changed my view of what a historical novel could be. Just extraordinary, back in the 70s.
Yeah, to be sure, there are no more dispiriting words in the English language, perhaps, than her bosom heaved. But I think that it's the same in any, what we look at as literary fiction, there's a gamut of proficiency in that too.
Yeah.
So no surprise there's a gamut of proficiency in historical fiction.
Well, I'll ask you a final question because we're going to take some questions from the audience in a moment. But, when you mentioned, this is trying to weave together some of the things we've been talking about. You mentioned Hilary Mantel and Thomas Cromwell. Obviously, we have Hilary Mantel's great portrait of him. But then you can go to New York or just go on the internet these days and look up Holbein's picture of him, which sits opposite Thomas More.
Yes.
Across the fireplace in the Frick Museum. Most extraordinary picture. So, Holbein was there, and he was a very, very accurate portrayer of the people around him. And there are, I saw an impassioned rave by an art critic saying, I simply cannot believe Hilary Mantel's portrait of him. Does that matter? I mean, when the historical fiction and what's there at the beginning are seem to be so radically at odds, does it matter?
Well, I went to Catholic school, and if I saw A Man for All Seasons once, I saw it a dozen times. The nuns loved that movie.
Yeah.
And Thomas More is such a hero in that movie, and of course not a hero in Wolf Hall. And I love that. I love that she has completely flipped the script on my understanding of those two men. And maybe that's what fiction should do, is make you question your assumptions. And we'll never probably have a definitive answer, but I do trust her. I think that her research and her sixth sense, I mean, it's as if she was Thomas Cromwell. I mean, you can feel the nap of the velvet, and you can smell the kitchen aromas. She's there ducking and weaving through those halls of power.
Yeah.
If I believed in reincarnation, I'd say she was Thomas Cromwell. And that's an achievement.
Yeah. So let's take some questions. I think there are ushers with microphones walking down the aisles. So make yourself known to them and ask Geraldine a question. I'm a little blinded here, so I can't see. Someone?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
I guess my question revolves around the question of the relation of fiction to truth. And it seems tonight truth has been discussed in terms of historical facticity. Whereas, I think fiction has a really wonderful way of delving into a far deeper sense of truth and delivering us up into changed visions or changed experiences in ways that just carrying along with the facts doesn't. I'd just like to hear what you think of that.
I think that great writing that is factual can also be incredibly stirring and mind-changing and I was delighted that the Nobel Prize went to a journalist, and I've only just started to read her work, but that is the kind of factual reporting, but it is so literary in the devices that she uses to tell the stories of real people and real events. So I don't think that fiction has a special role. I think anyone who's telling a story is trying to get to the same place, which is to make it as immediate and as involving and as engrossing as possible. And I think in some ways it's a false dichotomy that we've set up here.
For all the questions that I've been asking, I might just say that I know more about the Napoleonic War and Nelson's Navy from Patrick O'Brien, know more about the Roman emperors through just Robert Graves' I, Claudius, know more about Alexander the Great because of Mary Renault than I have ever learned from history books, because those people bring these things alive, and that's, I guess, the difference.
I think that, though, if you want to irritate a historian, give him a credit in your acknowledgements.
Geraldine, I was wondering what it's like to not just write about people out of your time, but out of your culture as well. So Hilary Mantel talks about discovering the essential Thomas Cromwell, but she's still got a heritage connection to him. He still has a language connection to him. But I wonder what it's like when somebody is incredibly foreign to you, how you enter into their imagination and create those characters.
Somebody who's incredibly foreign to you. It's dangerous and it's challenging to take that step, and certainly there was a lot of risk and responsibility in trying to tell the story of Caleb Cheshtirmak, because for one thing I'm very aware of the issue of appropriation, and so much of Native American culture has been appropriated away. But I also felt that his story should be better known, and I wanted people to understand what he achieved and what it cost, and the whole story of the Indian College at Harvard University, which still has ramifications today because that college got money that kept it afloat from donors who wanted to educate Native Americans, and yet the money was spent on English students almost exclusively, and the English at the Indian College was allowed to fall down. And there's a lot of discussion among Native American students today that Harvard owes a debt that hasn't quite fully been repaid to them for taking that money under false pretenses. So I think it was an interesting and worthwhile issue to delve into. I would not have had the audacity to try and tell the story as Caleb, perhaps, because I think his story is inaccessible to me until such a time. I could hear him maybe speaking in Latin when he embraced his life as an intellectual among Westerners, but I wouldn't be able to hear the voice of his heart in his native Wampanoag language. So that's why I needed a different storyteller for a narrator for that book. Bethia, who was more accessible to me.
But you, again, are totally immersed in the language and the religious culture to an extent where, for me, there's no kind of sense of, there's no break, there's no feeling that this is a 21st century author writing about somebody so long ago.
It's interesting because there are no women's diaries from that period. Indeed, there are no women's diaries for another 100 years. Very few letters, because women weren't necessarily taught to write. The Puritans believed that women should be able to read because it was a good thing for a mother to be able to read the Bible to her children. But writing is a skill that you use to communicate with people outside of the family, so why would any Puritan good wife need to do that? And yet you can hear her voice. How? Because in the church courts of New England, women were always being dragged in and called to account, and there was verbatim record kept. So you can hear women speaking in their own voices. You can hear the vocabulary they used and the expressions they used, and you can feel the anger as they defend themselves. Yeah. And people sometimes say, your women are too modern and too feminist. I say, go and read some 17th century court records. Yeah. Because we weren't the first generation to know we were getting a bum deal.
Someone in the front row.
Geraldine, I just wanted to ask if you have another novel on the drawing board yet, and if so, what part of history is it likely to cover?
So, I do have another fairly well-developed idea. I haven't really got stuck into it yet, but that's my plan for the new year. And because it looks like we're going to have to keep our 12-year-old in school where he is at the moment, it's another American story, although I do have a wonderful Australian idea that I can't wait to get to as soon as we can get back here. This book is a bit like People of the Book in that it's a braided narrative of 3 time periods. And I'm not going to say too much about it, but just that one time period is just before and during the Civil War, and that involves a wonderful racehorse and the painter who painted him. And then the next period is the 1940s in New York City, at the beginnings of abstract expressionism. And the fate of a missing painting of that horse is bound up into that thread. And then there's a contemporary story about, that brings it all together. So it's about a fantastic horse and a missing painting, 2 things I like very much.
I want to read this book. Do you find that literary festivals slow up your writing? Should we be here at all? Should we?
I think it's good to get out. It's good to actually meet readers and visit bookstores and things of that nature. Yeah.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you transitioned from being a journalist dealing with only facts to fiction, where you potentially had an infinite number of storylines that you could potentially go down. Obviously, historical fiction will limit you to a certain extent, but still I wonder how you dealt with the infinite possibilities of fiction.
Yeah, so the transition was more or less determined by finally realizing that I was 39 years old, and if I was ever going to have a kid, it better happen. I I loved being a foreign correspondent so much that I was very reluctant to hear the ticking of any biological clocks whatsoever, until the Nigerians did me the favour of throwing me in jail and clarifying my mind on that issue because I didn't know how long they were going to keep me, and I thought if they keep me a year it might be too late. So luckily they threw me out of the country 3 days later. And I came home with a new plan, and my oldest son
was Tony happy about this?
Oh yes, yes. Well, he was certainly happy about the process. The enthusiasm with which I returned. And then I had an infant, and I didn't want to go off on long open-ended assignments to places where they threw you in the slammer. So I needed a new gig, and when you've been that fireman kind of reporter that gets sent to the hot spots of the world, nobody ever thinks of you for something benign that would be possibly compatible with an infant, like interviewing George Clooney by a swimming pool. You just don't get asked to do that. Well, you know what it's like. So I thought I have to find something that I can do that'll keep me close to home. And I had this story banging around in my head that had just been with me from the day that I stumbled into this little village in the Pennines, where the extraordinary had happened, the implausible truth had happened, which was when bubonic plague arrived. Instead of doing what everybody else in the world always did and run for your life, try and get out of the town, the villagers came together and took the self-sacrificing decision to quarantine themselves and stop the spread of infection beyond the village, and they lived for a year in this voluntary quarantine. And I was fascinated and had tried to look into the history of the village, but because everybody there except the minister was illiterate, they were all lead miners and shepherds, and they didn't leave any accounts of what that year was like. So the only way to engage with it is imagination. And so I sat down and decided to see if I could write it, and I wrote 3 chapters. And I'd already written 2 books of nonfiction, so I had an agent, and I sent off these 3 chapters to her, and I didn't hear anything. And I thought, oh, it stinks, and she's too polite. She doesn't want to break it to me. And I think a month passed, and then I got a call, and she said, well, I sold your book.
Whoa. Now I've got to write it.
She was showing it to anybody, and then I had to write it. So that was pretty amazing, and the most amazing thing of all was that people actually wanted to read it.
Yeah. And tell the story about your son. How does your son describe the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh yeah, Mum's very busy, he said that day. She just got the Pulitzer surprise.
I'll say. So, somebody there? Yeah?
Hi, Geraldine. I was just wondering about your comment about not wanting to write fiction that's modern. I mean, what would a fictional 9 Parts of Desire look like?
Well, but why would you see? Why would you write a fictional 9 Parts of Desire when it's accessible for you to actually find out about those women's lives? So why wouldn't you do that? And that's my, my journalistic instincts. If I didn't have children, the story that I would want to tell, as insanely dangerous as it is, would be to dust out my old chador and go and, live among the women of ISIS and find out, what are they thinking? What are they thinking? These girls from England who ran off to marry those guys.
Yeah. It's extraordinary, isn't it? We're just about out of time, I think, but I just had this last-minute question. When you were talking about Bethia and the trials, I was thinking about Arthur Miller and The Crucible, which was clearly a book about its own time as well as a book about history. Does your writing work on that level? Is there anything allegorical in your writing? Are you thinking about the present when you write about history?
Usually not, but occasionally it breaks in on you. I think that in March, when the narration switches from Mr. March to Mrs. March, and she's thinking about the costs of the Civil War and all the lies or the wrong assumptions on which people went to war, which was that it was going to be over in 3 weeks. And, at very little cost, great things could be achieved. And she's sitting there among the broken bodies of boys of both sides of that war, and she's thinking about how people get duped into war and her culpability in being a part of crying up the war. And that was me and the Gulf War, really, the Iraq invasion, because, I thought we should go in against Saddam, and boy, was that wrong, so...
But, to play the devil's advocate, or no, whatever the opposite of that is, on your behalf, you had been through the Balkans War, and you, like me, had seen what happened. You'd probably been in Saddam's Iraq before the first Gulf War.
I was in Iraq a lot. I thought it was the biggest fear state I could imagine.
Yeah,
that just showed the lack of imagination that I had, because we've seen so much worse. But I didn't know what he had. I knew he had his boot on the people. I didn't know that he had his boot clamped down on so much sectarian hatred, because that was not apparent at the time. But the main reason was I'd been in Kurdistan, and I'd been with the Kurds when they rose up against him, and I was with them when they liberated the security prisons and saw the torture chambers and the horrible excrement-filled dark cells. And then we betrayed them and let Saddam come and basically, suppress the uprising in the north and the south of his country and hold on to power. And the sanctions regime was only enriching him and his corrupt cronies and hurting the ordinary people of Iraq. So that was why. But I realize now that, I didn't imagine how feckless the Bush administration would be in not making any plan for the peace. But even given that, I now think that it was for the Iraqis to do and not for us.
Right. Dark note on which to end, but we have to end there.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
But we've covered...
Bummed everybody out. Great, thanks a lot.
Well, I think it's just an example in some ways of the things that we've been talking about all evening, about how history changes according to your perspective on it, and the one of the things about writing history and writing historical fiction is that it probably helps people to understand that, and if we don't understand that, then we won't understand the history, and we won't be able to draw any lessons from the consequences at all. But it's it was a dark note to end on, but we've covered a huge amount of ground.
Thank you.